In this video, you'll follow the emotional journey of Hans Müller, heir to an empire built on the cruelty of his father. Used to power and wealth, Hans's life changes when he crosses paths with a humble family destroyed by the heartless actions of his own family. How will he cope when he discovers that behind his fortune lies the deep scars of innocent people, like Benjamin, Susan, and their children, Ethan and Emily? Can one man truly fix what was so brutally broken? As Hans gets closer to this family, he starts questioning everything he's ever known and begins dismantling the dark legacy his father built. But the road to redemption is long and full of challenges. How will he face the wrath of his father, who returns determined to protect his empire at all costs? More importantly, can the family ruined by Wilhelm find it in their hearts to forgive the son of the man who destroyed their lives? As the story unfolds, Hans finds himself fighting not only to save his own future, but to protect those he's wronged the most. But will that be enough to earn Benjamin and Susan's forgiveness? And what happens when everything seems to be moving toward reconciliation? Stay until the end to find out how a simple dinner can reveal the true meaning of family and redemption. In the heart of the urbanized city of Cedarwood, the restaurant La Fortuna stood as a symbol of luxury and exclusivity. It was frequented by politicians, successful bus placiness men, and occasionally local families hoping to catch a glimpse of what they called the good life. That night, the restaurant was especially busy, with twinkling lights reflecting off the golden mirrors and crystal glasses on the tables. Benjamin entered with his wife, Susan, and their children, Ethan and Emily, feeling the weight of the place on their shoulders. They were there to celebrate Susan's birthday, a tradition that Benjamin strived to keep alive despite their growing financial difficulties. As they walked through the dining room, the glances of other patrons subtly followed them, almost imperceptibly, but Susan felt each one as a reminder of how out of place they were. The rich decor and the aroma of sophisticated dishes only intensified her nostalgia for the days when Benjamin was a prosperous man, before they were betrayed by someone they trusted. Seated at the table, the atmosphere felt even more oppressive. Susan tried to force a smile so that her children, Ethan and Emily, wouldn't notice the weight she carried.
Let's make this day a special moment,
she thought, even as tears threatened to break through her determination. Benjamin felt the tightness in his chest as he watched his wife's effort to keep the mood light. He held her hand for a moment, trying to convey what words could not.
I'm so sorry.
But both knew that no matter how hard they tried, the brightness of that night could never overshadow the shadows of their reality. The restaurant's entrance door opened with an air of grandeur that drew the attention of everyone. Hans Müller, a German millionaire known for his arrogance, entered accompanied by a group of friends who laughed loudly and chatted without regard for those around them. Hans was an imposing figure, and his air of superiority seemed to imbue him with unshakable self-confidence. He enjoyed flaunting his wealth and, above all, held contempt for anything he considered weak or insignificant. As he scanned the room with a quick glance, Hans soon noticed the presence of the humble family sitting at a nearby table. Benjamin, Susan, and their children looked like a painting out of place, something he could not ignore. To Hans, they represented exactly the kind of people he despised, those who, in his opinion, would never achieve success because they simply did not belong in the world of the strong and successful. He did not see a family struggling to maintain their dignity amidst adversity. He saw weakness, and weakness was something he deeply scorned. With a cynical smile, Hans began to make snide comments aloud, loud enough for Benjamin and Susan to hear clearly.
I'm always surprised by the type of people who think they can mingle here,
he said, laughing with his friends.
Look at them. They look like they just came from a clearance sale.
The cruel laughter of his friends echoed in the room, turning what should have been a night of celebration into a nightmare for the family. Benjamin felt his face burn with shame while Susan struggled to keep her tears in check, knowing their children were hearing every word, even if they didn't fully understand. Clara, a young and attentive waitress who had worked at La Fortuna for a few years, knew Benjamin's family well. She vividly remembered the time when they were regular customers, coming to the restaurant often, always well-dressed and with radiant smiles, enjoying meals as a prosperous and happy family. In those days, Clara served them regularly, and the warmth they exuded was contagious, making her job a pleasant experience. However, after the blow that devastated Benjamin's finances, Clara had only seen them once a year, when they came to celebrate Susan's birthday. The transition from prosperity to the struggle for dignity was painfully evident. They maintained the annual tradition as if that dinner was a way to cling to what remained of their happy days. Clara deeply respected that strength, but upon witnessing Hans's provocations that night, she felt a mix of anger and sadness that left her momentarily speechless. She watched as Benjamin and Susan tried to continue their meal while their faces expressed a pain that Clara could only imagine. Ethan and Emily, innocent and oblivious to the true nature of those cruel words, began to sense that something was wrong when they saw tears in their mother's eyes. Clara knew she could not allow that night to turn into a complete nightmare for the family. She felt a personal responsibility, a need to do something, anything, to try to alleviate the pain that Hans inflicted with his venomous words. Determined not to let the situation worsen, Clara approached Hans's table with firm steps, maintaining her composure. As she served the millionaire's table, she avoided looking directly into his eyes, but her mind was clear. She would do whatever it took to try to restore a bit of dignity to that family, who deserved more than to be treated with disdain on such a special occasion. Hans Müller, with his mischievous smile, continued to glare at Benjamin's family, each word that came out of his mouth more cruel than the last. The German millionaire saw no limits to his disdain, openly mocking the modest clothes that Benjamin wore.
Look at this, my friends.
He said in a tone that mixed irony and contempt.
It seems some people still believe they can hide among us, as if failure isn't stamped on every piece of clothing they wear.
His friends laughed loudly, a chorus of jeers that pierced the air like sharp knives. Susan, upon hearing this, felt a deep pain. Each insult from Hans was like a blade tearing away at her dignity. She knew that the clothes they wore were simple, that her family's appearance was unworthy of such a luxurious environment, but it was all they could afford. However, what hurt the most was that Hans was mocking not just the clothes, but what those clothes represented. The daily struggle to keep the family united and dignified, even amidst the chaos that had consumed their lives. She struggled to maintain her composure, to not cry in front of her children. But the pain was almost unbearable, especially watching Ethan's smile fade and the sparkle in Emily's eyes dim. Hans, noticing the impact of his words, did not stop. He continued, now directing his disdain toward Susan.
And this lady
He said with a disdainful laugh.
tries so hard to seem refined, but can't hide what she really is. Maybe a little common sense would make her realize she is completely out of place.
The words cut Susan like a scalpel, exposing her deepest insecurities and fears of not being enough, of not being able to protect her children from this cruel reality. She felt that all her dignity was being stripped away before Ethan and Emily's eyes, and the humiliation was devastating. Benjamin, who had remained silent until that moment, felt something inside him break. With each insult from Hans, he watched his family shrink a little more, sinking into a sadness that he knew he wouldn't be able to repair easily. He looked at Susan, who was struggling not to cry, and felt a wave of helplessness wash over him. He was supposed to be the protector of the family, the one who supported them in tough times, but at that moment, all he could feel was failure. With a trembling hand, Benjamin grabbed Susan's hand under the table. He tried to convey some strength, some sense that everything would be okay, but he didn't believe it himself. The look Susan gave him in return was a mix of gratitude and despair. They both knew that no matter how hard they tried, they were crumbling. The public humiliation, the shame, the fact that their children were witnessing it all, it was too much to bear. Ethan, who had always been a cheerful boy, now stared at the plate in front of him, untouched by food. He didn't fully understand what was happening, but he knew it was bad. He felt the tension in the air, sensed the pain in his mother's eyes, and the stiffness in his father's posture. Emily, who had always seen her mother as an unshakable figure, now held Susan's hand tightly, as if trying to hold back the tears that were about to spill from her mother's face. For Benjamin, seeing his children's smiles disappear was the greatest punishment. He wondered desperately how he had allowed his life to come to this point, how he had lost control of everything. The feeling of failure gnawed at him from within, and he felt as if he would crumble at any moment. Clara, who was serving other tables, couldn't take her eyes off Benjamin's family. She had witnessed the fall of that family over the years, and seeing their suffering that night was unbearable. Clara knew she couldn't just stand by while Hans continued his relentless verbal assault. She felt a knot in her throat and her heart tightening at the sight of Susan's state and the pain in Benjamin's eyes, something she would never forget. Determined to do something, Clara approached Hans's table to deliver the check. As she walked over, she decided she had to act. Grabbing a small piece of paper, Clara quickly wrote a note. Her hands trembled as she carefully chose the words, wanting to hit Hans the same way he had struck that family.
You may have money,
Clara wrote,
but you don't know the true value of dignity. This family that you humiliate has more strength and courage than you will ever have.
She folded the note carefully and discreetly placed it inside the bill holder. When she reached Hans's table, Clara placed the bill holder in front of him, and for a brief moment, their eyes met. There was something in Hans's gaze that made her shiver, but she did not look away. In her mind, she silently repeated a prayer, hoping that her words would have some impact, that somehow they could restore the dignity of the family that had been cruelly shattered that night. Clara knew that what she was doing was risky, but she didn't care. She just wanted Hans to understand, if only for a second, the harm he was causing. Hans Müller, still savoring the impact of his venomous words, casually picked up the bill folder. He was about to open it to retrieve his credit card, but noticed something different. A folded note, carefully placed alongside the bill. Intrigued, he opened the paper, unaware of the content he was about to face. As he read the words written by Clara, the confident, superior expression he wore began to unravel.
This family you despise once had a dignified life, but they lost everything due to a dirty and well-orchestrated scam. Benjamin, an honest worker, was betrayed and left to sink into debt by his own boss, never able to prove his innocence. Susan sacrifices everything for her children, and they still find the strength to maintain their dignity. What you see in them is not weakness, but courage. True wealth is not in money, but in character.
Hans felt his heart stop for a moment, as if each word of the note were a heavy stone falling on his chest. He reread the note, trying to process what was before his eyes. This was not just a reminder of the pain he inflicted. It was a direct accusation, a mirror reflecting a truth he had long avoided. The note challenged the worldview he carried, forcing him to acknowledge the inhumanity of his actions. His hands began to tremble slightly, something he hadn't felt in years. For a brief moment, Hans found himself paralyzed. He looked around, trying to regain his composure, but the words in the note had already done their work. He could no longer look at Benjamin and Susan without feeling the weight of the guilt beginning to form within him. The glances of the friends surrounding him, still laughing and commenting about dinner, now sounded distant, as if he were separated from the world by a thin, fragile glass. The reality of his cruelty hit him with an unexpected force, leaving him unable to react immediately. The words of the note echoed in Hans's mind like thunder, a thunder that did not cease but repeated, growing louder and more deafening.
True wealth is not in money, but in character.
He felt those words tearing at his soul like sharp claws, penetrating beyond the facade of arrogance he had meticulously built over the years. For the first time in a long time, Hans felt something he could not immediately name, but that left him uncomfortable, almost nauseated. He tried to continue acting as if nothing had happened, as if the note were merely a foolish provocation that did not deserve his attention. He laughed at something one of his friends said, but the sound of his own laughter felt empty, forced. He could no longer focus on the conversations around him or the smiling faces of his companions. Clara's words continued to reverberate in his mind, erasing any other thought.
You see weakness, but it is courage.
Hans felt the mask of indifference he always wore beginning to crack. Shame and guilt began to infiltrate his heart, a heart he had armored against these emotions for so long. He had always believed that success was about power and control, about being on top and keeping everyone else beneath. But now, those simple words were tearing him down, stripping away the insecurities he had buried since youth. Hans remembered how he had vowed never to be weak again, never to be humiliated as his family had been. But over the years, in his relentless pursuit of power, he had become exactly the kind of man he despised the most, someone who used his power to crush others. Back in his immense mansion, Hans sat in his favorite armchair, surrounded by the luxury and opulence he valued so much. But that night, none of these things could bring him comfort. The memories he had long avoided began to invade him with overwhelming intensity. He remembered the poor childhood, the humiliations his mother suffered at the hands of men like the one he had become. Wilhelm, his father, was one of those men, cold, calculating, relentless. Hans had vowed to himself that he would never be like him, but now, looking at himself in the mirror, he saw his father's features reflected in his own image. The memories assaulted him forcefully. He recalled the small, dilapidated house he grew up in, the condescending looks from the neighbors, the muffled laughter of schoolmates who knew he didn't have what they had. But above all, he remembered his mother's gaze, a look of resignation, of acceptance of a life full of deprivations and cruelty. That same look, he realized, was what he had seen in Susan's eyes that night. It was the look of someone who had lost everything but dignity and who fought to keep that last piece from slipping away. Hans felt a growing despair as he realized that, in his quest for power and control, he had become the embodiment of everything he hated about his father. He remembered the promises he made to himself that he would never allow money or power to corrupt him. But there he was, living in an immense mansion, surrounded by wealth, but completely devoid of any trace of humanity. The image of Benjamin, humiliated and powerless, blended with that of his own mother, and Hans found himself filled with an anguish he hadn't felt in a long time. He realized, with a silent terror, that he had become the man he despised the most. Ah! Clara's note echoed in Hans Miller's mind like a clock whose incessant ticking marked each second with a pain he could barely endure. The feeling of guilt had infiltrated his thoughts, and doubt began to corrode his confidence. Determined to understand better what he had read, Hans initiated a discreet investigation into Benjamin and his family. He wanted to learn more about the origin of the dignity that the note exalted, and that in some way made him feel so small and despicable. As the days went by, Hans began to piece together a story that turned out to be much closer to his life than he could have ever imagined. Using his contacts and resources, he discovered that Benjamin had been the victim of a financial scam. The company Benjamin worked for had been manipulated by someone he trusted completely. When Hans learned the name of the culprit, he felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. The culprit was none other than his own father, Wilhelm Müller. Wilhelm always boasted about being a ruthless businessman, someone who did whatever it took to ensure his success. Hans had heard this phrase so many times throughout his life that it had become part of the family's ethos, but he had never reflected on what it truly meant until now. Wilhelm never mentioned the lives he destroyed in the process, never spoke of the ruined families or shattered dreams. To him, it was all just a game of power and control, where the strong triumphed and the weak were eliminated. Overwhelmed by a mix of horror and guilt, Hans tried to mentally confront his father's actions, but it was like looking into a shattered mirror, where each fragment reflected a distorted version of himself. He realized that over the years, he had absorbed Wilhelm's philosophy, becoming a younger but equally cruel version of the man he had vowed never to become. And now, Benjamin's family, a family he had humiliated and despised, was yet another victim of his father's actions and, by extension, of his own. The weight of the revelation was almost unbearable for Hans. He isolated himself in his mansion, refusing to see or speak to anyone. The alcohol, which he once consumed at celebrations and lavish dinners, became his refuge. Each sip was a desperate attempt to numb the pain, to silence the overwhelming guilt that consumed him from within. But instead of finding relief, Hans only sank deeper into darkness. Every time he closed his eyes, images of Benjamin, Susan, Ethan, and Emily flooded his mind, haunting him. He saw their faces, marked by suffering, reflecting the injustice that Wilhelm, and by extension, himself, had caused. Hans knew that in a way he was complicit. He had benefited from the empire built by his father, conveniently ignoring the consequences for those who were left in the wake, and now he could no longer pretend to be innocent. The alcohol did not bring the relief he had hoped for. Instead, it intensified his despair, deepening the sense that his world was crumbling. Memories of his own impoverished childhood intertwined with the image of Benjamin's family. He saw himself in Ethan, an innocent boy, watching his parents struggle against a world that seemed relentlessly cruel. He saw his mother in Susan, a woman who, despite everything, held her head high, trying to protect her children from the crushing weight of reality. But above all, Hans saw the shadow of his father, Wilhelm, looming over them all. A ghost of ambition and cruelty that he himself had invoked without realizing it. Panic and guilt consumed him, leaving him on the verge of collapse as Clara's words from the note echoed in his mind, an unrelenting sentence he could not escape. After days trapped in a cycle of self-destruction, Hans realized he could not continue like this. What he had discovered about the scam and his father's responsibility was eating away at him, but he knew that drinking to forget was not the solution. He needed to face the truth, not just for himself, but also for the family that had been destroyed by Wilhelm's actions. Hans made a decision. He would try to correct what he could, even if that meant exposing his own father and destroying the family's legacy. Determined, Hans sought out Clara at La Fortuna. He knew the waitress played a crucial role in this journey of redemption he was about to embark on. Upon finding her, Hans, with a sincerity Clara had never seen before, asked for her help in arranging a meeting with Benjamin and Susan. He knew he needed to tell the truth, even if it meant losing his last chance for redemption. Clara, still wary but sensing the seriousness and desperation in Hans's eyes, agreed to help. The meeting was set in a small park, away from the oppressive luxury of the restaurant. When Benjamin and Susan arrived, with their children by their side, Hans felt a mix of dread and shame. He knew that the words he was about to say would change everything. Trembling, Hans confessed that his father, Wilhelm, was responsible for the scam that had ruined their lives. The silence that followed was suffocating. Benjamin, with clenched fists, erupted in anger, blaming Hans for everything, seeing him as an extension of Wilhelm's cruelty. Susan, powerless, crumbled, clutching her children in despair as if she could protect them from the invisible scars that this revelation brought. Hans felt like the worst human being in the world, unable to offer any consolation or justification. The weight of his guilt felt crushing, and he realized that no matter how hard he tried, he could never undo the harm that had been done. The pain in Benjamin's gaze and Susan's desperation were like thorns piercing him from all sides, and Hans knew in that moment that his journey of redemption would be much more difficult than he had imagined. The impact of Hans's words still lingered in the air, like a dense fog enveloping everyone in the park. Benjamin, his face twisted in anger and pain, took long strides away from Hans, each movement carrying the intention to sever any ties with that man and his family.
I don't want to hear anything more.
Benjamin shouted, his voice echoing among the trees, filled with a fury he had never felt before. His eyes were wide, filled with raw pain, as he tried to push away the image of Wilhelm, and now Hans, that seemed to hover over his life like a ghost he couldn't exorcise. Susan, on her part, was paralyzed. Hans's words had penetrated deeply, stripping away any strength she had left to stand. Tears streamed silently down her face as she pressed her hands against her chest, trying to find some form of solace amid the storm of emotions crashing over her. But something inside Susan, a soft yet persistent voice, told her that running away now was not the answer. She knew that Hans was trying to correct something that, deep down, he hadn't directly caused. Wilhelm was the true monster, but Hans in some way was there, facing the consequences, something Wilhelm would never do.
Benjamin.
Susan whispered, her voice trembling but firm enough to break the silence. He stopped but didn't turn around.
Please, just listen to what he has to say.
Benjamin didn't respond immediately. His body was rigid, as if Susan's words had turned him to stone. Finally, he turned, his eyes still filled with fury but also confusion and exhaustion. He knew Susan was right, that he needed to hear Hans out, even if just for the last time. With a brief and reluctant nod, Benjamin indicated for Hans to speak while crossing his arms and maintaining a distance that reflected the barrier he had erected in his heart. The atmosphere between them was tense, a taut string ready to snap, yet there was a small opening for dialogue. Hans felt the tension in the air like an electric current, coursing through his body and threatening to leave him paralyzed. But he knew he couldn't back down now. Trembling slightly, he tried to find the right words, the ones that could at least begin to undo the harm his family had caused.
I know that words can't repair what has been done.
He began, his voice quivering, laden with a sincerity he rarely showed.
But I want to try. I want to do something, anything, to help correct what my father did to you.
Benjamin pressed his lips together, his face hardened like a rock, but Susan continued to look at Hans, her eyes filled with expectation and pain.
I don't want anything in return.
Hans continued,
I just want you to have a chance to start over. The amount I'm offering is exactly what my father stole from you. I know this doesn't erase the suffering, doesn't bring back what you lost, but it could give you a new opportunity.
He extended an envelope, his hands still trembling, feeling the weight of that gesture. Susan looked at Benjamin, seeking support, a sign of what she should do. The silence between them was heavy, filled with meaning. Benjamin finally took the envelope but didn't open it right away. He held the object with a grip that conveyed his anger, his indecision. Each passing second felt like an eternity. He looked at Susan, then at Hans, and then at the children, who were playing in the distance, oblivious to the drama unfolding. After what felt like an eternity, Benjamin finally sighed, defeated. He knew that accepting that offer was something he could never do for himself, but for his children, he understood he had to consider it.
This isn't for me.
He said, his voice cold and distant.
It's for them.
He was referring to the children, and everyone knew it. The acceptance came with an overwhelming weight, a burden that Benjamin would carry forever, knowing that in some way he was selling his forgiveness. But Susan, with a soft and understanding look, held her husband's hand, convincing him that it was a necessary step to move forward. Hans felt a wave of relief and pain at the same time when Benjamin accepted the envelope. He knew that it wasn't a gesture of reconciliation, but a practical necessity for Benjamin's family. But for Hans, it meant more. It was the first step, the first concrete act in his attempt to repair a past filled with mistakes. He knew that money couldn't buy forgiveness, but it could at least provide a new chance for that family, something he knew he had to do. With a still tense voice, Hans extended another envelope, this time containing the keys to a new home.
I found a place.
He said, struggling to keep his voice steady.
It's a place where you can start over, away from all the painful memories.
Susan took the envelope with the keys, her hands trembling. When her fingers touched the cold metal, the tears she had been trying to hold back finally began to flow freely down her face. She held the keys with a mixture of gratitude and sadness, knowing that this gesture symbolized more than just a change of address. It was the beginning of a new life, but also the closing of a painful chapter that could never be completely forgotten. Benjamin, still torn between resentment and gratitude, remained silent. He looked at Hans, trying to reconcile the image of that man with what he knew about his father Wilhelm. The anger still simmered in his heart, but he also knew that Hans was trying, in some way, to do what was right. With a silent nod, Benjamin accepted the keys, holding them tightly as his thoughts raced 1,000 miles per hour. He knew that the change they were about to make was necessary, but that didn't make things any easier. Hans stood still, watching as Benjamin and Susan walked away, their figures slowly dissolving into the twilight. He knew this was a bittersweet victory, if it could even be called that. He still carried the weight of his guilt, but now there was a small spark of hope. A hope that perhaps he could continue to try, to do more, until one day, who knows, he could look in the mirror and see someone not haunted by the past. The tension in the air remained, but there was also a glimpse of something new, a possibility for a fresh start, both for Benjamin's family and for himself. Hans Müller sat alone in his immense office, surrounded by stacks of documents that represented the vast extent of the empire his father, Wilhelm, had built. The room, with its walls adorned with valuable paintings and fine wooden furniture, felt colder than ever. Each item, each contract, each decision made by Wilhelm now seemed to carry the weight of the lives that had been crushed for that empire to grow. Hans knew that what he was about to do would be painful, but he also knew it was necessary. He needed to correct the wrongs, to undo the dark legacy he had inherited, even if it meant destroying everything his father had built. With a heavy sigh, Hans began signing the documents that ordered the sale and dissolution of various companies and investments left by his father. Each signature was a blow against what Wilhelm had left him. He felt the pain of erasing the past, as if he were tearing pages from a book that, although stained with blood and tears, was still part of his history. But Hans also knew he could no longer carry the burden of that empire. He needed to undo the evil that had been done, even if it meant sacrificing the fortune he had inherited. With each broken contract, Hans felt the burden of guilt slowly being replaced by a sense of purpose. He was determined to use his family's resources to repair the injustices committed by his father. However, the pain of destroying what had been built did not easily fade. Each decision was accompanied by a sense of loss, a reminder that he was not only erasing Wilhelm's legacy, but also redefining his own. Clara's note echoed in his mind, a constant reminder that true wealth was not in money, but in character. As Hans fought his personal battle against his father's legacy, Benjamin and Susan were trying to rebuild their lives in the new home that Hans had provided for them. The house was modest but comfortable, a place where they could start over, away from the painful memories that haunted them in Cedarwood. However, even with the move, Benjamin and Susan found themselves caught in a mix of relief and guilt. The relief came from the sense of security, knowing they now had a solid roof over their heads, a place where they could raise their children without the constant shadow of the past. But the guilt, that was harder to overcome. Benjamin felt the guilt as a constant weight in his chest, a reminder that somehow he had accepted help from the son of the man who had ruined his life. Every time he looked at the walls of the new house, he felt a mix of gratitude and resentment. He knew that Hans was trying to do the right thing, but the hurt was still there, a wound that would not heal easily. Susan, on the other hand, found herself torn between gratitude for Hans and sadness for everything they had lost. She saw the new house as a symbol of hope, but also as a painful reminder of the price they had paid to get there. Ethan and Emily, still innocent to the drama surrounding the adults, played in the yard, their laughter filling the air with a sound of renewal and new life. For them, the move was an adventure, an opportunity to explore new places and make new friends. They did not carry the burden of their parents' decisions, nor did they understand the depth of the scars that Benjamin and Susan bore. For Susan, watching her children play with such joy was a relief, but also a trigger for her emotions. When she found herself alone in the new kitchen, The weight of everything they had been through finally hit her hard. She broke down in tears, thanking God for this second chance, but also mourning everything they had lost. She cried not only for the old house, but for the dreams, the hopes, and the man Benjamin had been before everything crumbled. A few weeks later, Hans decided to make one last visit to Benjamin and Susan's new home. He knew this visit would be difficult, but he felt it was necessary. He needed to see with his own eyes that the family was beginning to rebuild their lives. Hans arrived at the new house on a sunny afternoon, carrying with him a sense of nervousness and hope. When he knocked on the door, he was greeted by Susan, who opened the door with a tired but genuine smile.
Come in, Hans.
She said, her voice soft and welcoming, despite everything they had been through. There was a cordiality in the air, but also a palpable tension. Hans entered the house, observing how the environment reflected the new life Benjamin and Susan were trying to build. It was a modest home, but there were personal touches in every corner. Family photos on the walls, toys scattered on the floor, and the smell of home-cooked food coming from the kitchen. Hans felt a wave of emotions wash over him, a mix of satisfaction for having helped and pain for knowing that, despite everything, the scars of the past were still there. Benjamin appeared in the living room, more receptive than the last time they had met, but still carrying the marks of everything that had happened.
Hans.
He greeted with a nod of his head, his voice softer but still distant. Hans's presence there was a constant reminder of the past, something Benjamin was trying to overcome. Even so, he knew that Hans was trying to do the right thing, and that was something he could not ignore. Hans, for his part, felt the weight of every unspoken word, of every glance that carried both gratitude and pain. He knew that redemption was not something that could be achieved in one fell swoop, and that the road to regain Benjamin and Susan's trust and respect would be long and difficult. But he also knew he was willing to walk that path, no matter how hard it might be.
I wanted to see how you are.
Hans said, trying to break the tension.
I hope the new house is serving you well.
Benjamin nodded, looking at Susan, who replied for them.
We're adjusting, Hans. It's a start, and we're grateful for that.
There was sincerity in her voice, but also a sadness she could not hide. Hans understood and felt that no matter how hard he tried, he could never completely erase the scars his family had left. When Hans said goodbye, he knew that his journey of redemption was just beginning. There was a small spark of hope, a chance that, perhaps one day, he could truly make a difference. But he also knew that this path would be long, marked by challenges and the constant need to prove that he was more than Wilhelm's dark legacy. With that determination, Hans left the house, knowing that the hardest battle was yet to come. Hans Miller was determined to prove that his transformation was genuine. Every day he felt the weight of his decisions, but also a new lightness that came from the effort to try to do the right thing. He knew that words would not be enough to repair the damage that had been done. Actions, he thought, were the only path to redemption. For this reason, he began to visit Benjamin and Susan's home regularly, offering help where he could, never being intrusive. At first, his visits were brief, almost formal, as if everyone were still testing the waters. But as the days passed, Hans began to feel more at ease in the family's presence, and surprisingly, Ethan and Emily started to warm up to him. The children, in their innocence, did not carry the resentment that weighed on the adults' shoulders. They saw Hans as a kind man who always brought small gifts, and whose attention to them seemed sincere. Ethan, in particular, began to see Hans as someone he could count on. Hans found himself sharing stories of his own childhood with the boy, stories that, although painful, helped him connect with the child. Emily, in turn, enjoyed the little treats Hans brought, like illustrated books or simple toys, but chosen with care. Hans realized that the bond he was starting to form with the children was a small but powerful sign of hope for him. There was something purifying in the way Ethan and Emily looked at him, something that gave him strength to continue on his journey of redemption. For Hans, who had long forgotten what it felt like to be part of a family, these moments were precious. He saw in the children's eyes an opportunity to truly redeem himself, to build something pure and good from the rubble of his past. And as he became more present in Ethan and Emily's lives, Hans felt that he was finally beginning to find a purpose that went beyond himself. But Hans knew that helping a single family would not be enough to erase the dark legacy left by his father. Wilhelm had caused deep damage to the Cedarwood community, and Hans felt he had the responsibility to repair those wrongs. Thus, he decided to invest in the town more broadly, funding social projects that could benefit those harmed by his father's predatory practices. One of Hans's first projects was the creation of a community center, where people could gather, participate in activities, and, above all, find support. He made sure that the center was a welcoming space, with programs that included everything from art classes for children to retraining programs for workers who had been affected by Wilhelm's business dealings. For Hans, each person he helped was a small part of his own redemption, a way to reconnect with the humanity he had lost by blindly following in his father's footsteps. Clara, the waitress who had been the catalyst for all this transformation, watched Hans's actions closely. She followed his progress in the community, the direct involvement he had with people, and above all, the sincerity that shone through his gestures. At first, Clara remained cautious, still uncertain if the change in Hans was real or merely an attempt to cleanse his conscience. But over time, she began to realize that he was indeed changed. The arrogant, cold man she had known in the restaurant seemed to have disappeared, giving way to someone who was trying in every possible way to do good. Hans, for his part, felt that each step he took to help others brought him closer to what he had always sought but had never found in his pursuit of wealth and power, a feeling of inner peace, of genuine connection with the world around him. He knew that the journey ahead was still long, but for the first time in many years, he felt that he was on the right path. Despite the visible changes in Hans's actions, Benjamin remained suspicious. He watched from a distance as Hans engaged with the community and his own family, still maintaining a certain emotional distance. Hans's constant presence in his home and in his children's lives unsettled him, even though he could not deny the changes he saw. Ethan and Emily spoke enthusiastically about Hans, which put Benjamin in a difficult position. He wanted to protect his children, but at the same time, he could not ignore that Hans was trying to do the right thing. On a quiet night, after the children had gone to bed, Benjamin finally decided to confront Hans. He needed to understand what truly motivated this man, what drove him to insist on helping after everything that had happened. Hans was sitting in the living room, a book in hand, when Benjamin entered, his shoulders tense and his gaze steady.
Why are you doing all this, Hans?
Benjamin asked bluntly.
What do you really want? Redemption? Or are you just trying to clear your conscience?
Hans slowly closed the book, letting out a heavy sigh. He knew this moment would come, and he was prepared to be honest.
Benjamin, I know that nothing I do can erase what my father did or what I did.
He began, his voice laden with sincerity.
But I'm doing this because I can't live with myself if I don't try to make a difference. The weight of guilt is unbearable. I'm not seeking immediate forgiveness, but rather trying to be a better person. I want to be someone I can be proud of one day.
Hans's words were spoken with such honesty that Benjamin felt something within him begin to give way. He was still hurt, still felt resentment, but he also could not deny the truth in Hans's words. The man before him no longer seemed like the monster Benjamin had imagined. There was a vulnerability in Hans that was hard to ignore, and for the first time, Benjamin began to realize that maybe, just maybe, Hans was not the enemy.
I still can't forgive you, Hans.
Benjamin said, his voice firm, but less hostile.
But I see that you are trying, and that is a start.
Hans nodded, accepting Benjamin's words as a step in his long journey. He knew that the path to redemption would be arduous, filled with challenges and obstacles, but for the first time, he felt there was a real chance to move forward, to do something good and true with his life, and for now, that was enough to keep fighting. The tension in the Miller mansion was palpable from the moment Wilhelm Miller returned to town. The news that his son was dismantling the empire he had built with such effort and cruelty hit him like a betrayal. For Wilhelm, every move Hans made was seen as a direct attack on the family legacy, something he could not tolerate. Wilhelm, a man who always believed in absolute power, in control over everyone around him, felt challenged by his own flesh and blood. Hans was in the office when his father barged in unannounced, the door slamming against the wall with a bang that echoed through the mansion's halls. Wilhelm was an imposing presence, with sharp eyes and a scowl that intimidated even the strongest men. Hans felt the air leave his lungs for a moment, but he had prepared for this confrontation, knowing it would happen sooner or later.
"What the hell do you think you're doing?"
roared Wilhelm, his voice like thunder that seemed to shake the house's foundations. He advanced on Hans, stopping only a few paces in front of his son, his glare piercing.
"You are destroying everything I built, sabotaging the empire I raised with my own hands. All the effort, all the sacrifice. And for what? To prove some insignificant moral point."
Hans remained calm, taking a deep breath before responding.
"I'm not sabotaging anything, Father. I'm correcting the mistakes you made. You built this empire on the pain and suffering of others. I cannot continue to benefit from it. I cannot allow it to go on. I need to do what is right."
Wilhelm, incredulous, let out a cold, derisive laugh.
"Doing what is right. Do you think this world is governed by what is right? You are weak, Hans. You always have been. And now you're proving it. You're destroying our family, our reputation. For what? So that people like those miserable ones you're helping can sleep better at night."
The tension in the room was so thick it could be cut with a knife. Wilhelm tried to intimidate Hans, using the same cruel tactics he had always employed to control those around him. But Hans, for the first time in his life, did not yield. He knew that confronting his father meant severing the last family ties he had, but he also knew he needed to do it to finally free himself from the oppressive shadow Wilhelm cast over his life. The argument between father and son escalated quickly. Wilhelm, feeling he was losing control, began to resort to even more brutal tactics. His tone became venomous, each word laden with rage and contempt.
"You are destroying yourself, Hans.
He snarled, his voice boiling with suppressed hatred.
And I will make sure that when you fall, you don't fall alone."
Hans sensed what was coming even before Wilhelm finished his sentence. In a fit of rage, his father threatened to destroy not only Hans's reputation, but also the lives of Benjamin, Susan, and their children. He knew where to strike to cause maximum damage and how to manipulate the circumstances so that everything would seem like an accident, an unfortunate coincidence.
"I can crush them like ants."
Wilhelm said, his face twisted into a cruel smile.
"And no one will even suspect it was anything other than bad luck. I am relentless, Hans. And I will show you what happens when someone tries to destroy what is mine."
Hans's heart raced in his chest, but he refused to be shaken. A rising heat began to take hold of his body, a righteous anger he had never felt so intensely before. Wilhelm had always been an unyielding man, but Hans could no longer allow him to wield that power for evil. In an act of courage he never thought himself capable of, Hans stepped forward, his eyes locked on his father's.
"No, Father, not this time. You will not touch them. I will sacrifice everything if necessary to protect them. Whatever you plan, I will be there to stop it."
Wilhelm was momentarily taken aback by the firmness in Hans's voice. This was no longer the submissive son he had shaped over the years. This was a man ready to fight, not just against his father, but against everything Wilhelm represented. Hans had found his strength, and that strength was rooted in the desire to protect those he had wronged. Wilhelm realized at that moment that the control he believed he had over Hans was crumbling. Wilhelm, realizing he was losing control over Hans, let out a scream of frustration. He was used to being obeyed, to having everyone around him bend to his will. Seeing Hans stand up to him was more than he could bear. In a fit of rage, Wilhelm cast one last curse upon his son, his words laden with venom.
"You are nothing without me, Hans. You are condemning yourself to ruin, and when you are alone, when all those miserable people you are trying to protect turn their backs on you, You will remember who you really are, a failure, a nobody.
Hans felt the impact of his father's words, but at the same time, he felt a strange sense of relief. It was as if he had finally ripped off the mask Wilhelm had placed on him his entire life. He knew that the battle with his father was far from over, that Wilhelm still had resources and power to cause harm. But in that moment, Hans felt he had taken the first step towards breaking free from the oppressive shadow that had dominated him. Wilhelm, furious and impotent, stormed out of the mansion, the doors slamming behind him like thunder echoing through the house. Hans was left alone in the room, breathing deeply, feeling the weight of his father's words slowly dissipate. For the first time, he felt that Wilhelm's power over him had weakened. The fight was just beginning, but Hans knew that for the first time, he was on the right side. Later that night, Hans decided to visit Benjamin and Susan. He needed to see the people he was fighting for, to remember why he was willing to sacrifice everything. Upon arriving at their home, he was greeted with a warmth that, although still marked by distrust, seemed less tense than before. Susan, with a worried look, immediately noticed that something profound had changed in Hans. He was calmer, but also more resolute, as if an internal battle had been won. Benjamin, observing Hans, noticed the same thing. The tension between them, which had once been almost unbearable, began to dissolve, giving way to a new form of respect and understanding. Hans didn't need to say much, his gaze said it all. He was committed to the cause, to protecting and repairing Benjamin's family, and now, with a strength he didn't know he had. Benjamin, still cautious, began to realize that Hans was not the monster he had imagined. He was a man who was finally finding his humanity. The months that followed the confrontation with his father were transformative for Hans Müller. He was determined not only to rebuild his life, but also to make amends for the mistakes of the past that weighed on his conscience. The journey to redemption, he discovered, was made up of small steps, sincere gestures, and a constant dedication to doing good. Hans did not limit himself to providing financial support to the people his father had harmed. He also became personally involved in their lives, trying to learn their stories, understand their pain, and offer real and lasting help. Benjamin and Susan were among those who occupied Hans's thoughts the most. Each visit he made to the family's new home brought a mix of emotions: hope, guilt, relief. Little by little, he saw the transformation of Benjamin and Susan. Over time, the new house began to resemble less a symbol of loss and more a place of rebirth. The plants that Susan tended flourished, and Benjamin's tense expression began to soften, especially as he watched his children play happily in the yard. Ethan and Emily, now closer to Hans, saw him almost as an uncle, someone who was always there to play, share stories, and listen to them attentively. For Hans, these visits were a balm for his soul. He saw in Ethan and Emily an opportunity to be part of something pure and true. He reveled in the children's laughter, in the way they ran to him when he arrived, always bringing something he knew would make them happy. With each smile he managed to elicit, he felt as if he were healing a small part of the great wound that had been opened. Susan, who always watched with a keen eye, began to see in Hans not the son of the man who had destroyed her life, but someone who, like her, was trying to rebuild. The transformation was slow but visible, and the house, which once seemed just a refuge, now began to turn into a real home. Hans's actions did not go unnoticed by Benjamin. He was a careful man who scrutinized every move Hans made with suspicion in the early months. But as time passed, Benjamin began to perceive that the change in Hans was genuine. The frequent visits, the small acts of kindness, and the dedication Hans showed to his family and the community were not superficial gestures. Hans was truly trying to be a better person. This was something Benjamin could not ignore, and after much reflection, he decided it was time to have a final conversation with him. On a quiet afternoon, Benjamin invited Hans to sit in the backyard of the house. Ethan and Emily played nearby, their laughter filling the air with a lightness that made the upcoming conversation seem less heavy. Benjamin, still holding a slight rigidity in his posture, turned to Hans.
I've been watching you, Hans.
Benjamin began with a tone that was both serious and welcoming.
And I've seen what you've been doing, not just for us, but for many others. I won't lie, it's still hard for me to forget everything that happened, but I also can't ignore that you're trying to change.
Hans listened in silence, his eyes locked on Benjamin's, realizing that this was a crucial moment.
I never wanted you to forgive me right away, Benjamin.
Hans replied, his voice low but firm.
But I knew I had to try. Not for me, but for you. For the people my father harmed. I knew I had to do something to make amends, even if it would never be enough.
Benjamin pondered those words for a moment, then looked at his hands before meeting Hans's gaze again.
I still can't forget,
He said,
but I see that you're genuinely trying. And I think it's time to let the past start to dissolve.
With those words, Benjamin extended his hand to Hans, a gesture that meant much more to both of them than just a simple handshake. It was a way for them to move forward, to acknowledge that while the past could not be erased, the future was still in their hands. Hans accepted Benjamin's hand, feeling the strength in that grip, a strength that came from both pain and the determination to move on. For both men, that handshake sealed a new phase of their lives. It was the beginning of a friendship based not only on forgiveness but on mutual respect, an understanding that both had suffered and that both were ready to start rebuilding from the ashes of a painful past. Over time, Hans began to reflect more deeply on his journey. He realized that although he had retained his fortune, it now meant something entirely different to him. Money, which had once been a symbol of power and control, became a tool to create something he could truly be proud of. He used his resources to build a legacy of kindness and justice, trying to correct what his father had destroyed. Each investment in community projects, each donation to just causes, was a way to redefine what it meant to be a Miller. However, as much as Hans focused on the present and the future, he knew there was something from the past he needed to confront one last time. He decided to visit his mother's grave, someone who, despite everything, always believed in his goodness, even when he was lost in the darkness his father had created. The cemetery was quiet when he arrived, the trees swaying gently in the breeze. Hans knelt before the simple tombstone, the words engraved there bringing forth memories of a woman he loved deeply.
I promise I will never be the man my father tried to make me.
Hans murmured, his voice barely a whisper.
I know I've made many mistakes, and I know the road to redemption is long. But I will keep trying, Mom. I will keep fighting to be the man you always believed I could be.
He stayed there for a while, reflecting on the past but also on the future he was building. When he finally said goodbye, Hans stood up, feeling a lightness in his heart that he hadn't felt in a long time. The weight of the past was still there, but it was less oppressive. He knew the battle wasn't over, but he also knew he was on the right path. With a new perspective on what it truly means to be rich, not in money, but in character and actions, Hans left the cemetery, ready to move forward with renewed determination and a clear purpose. He had found a new legacy, one he could finally call his own. Hans Miller was in a small coastal town, far removed from the shadows that his family had cast over Cedarwood. The town was simple, with quiet streets and surrounded by natural beauty that contrasted sharply with the opulent luxury Hans was accustomed to. He had chosen this place for a very special meeting, a meeting he had postponed for years, but which he knew was essential to complete his journey of redemption. He was there to reconnect with his younger sister Lena, someone he had neglected for so long while trapped in Wilhelm's suffocating expectations. Lena arrived at the cafe where they had agreed to meet, and upon seeing her, Hans felt a wave of emotions he could hardly express. She had changed little physically, but there was a maturity in her eyes, something he didn't remember seeing before. Hans stood up to greet her, but was momentarily speechless.
Lena,
He finally said, his voice laden with a mix of regret and relief. Lena smiled, a smile full of understanding and, to Hans's surprise, devoid of any trace of resentment. They sat down and slowly began to share the pains and scars that Wilhelm had left on both of them. Lena had endured much of what Hans had faced on her own, but without the added weight of their father's expectations, she had found healthier ways to cope. However, there was something healing in this meeting, something that allowed them both, for the first time, to be completely honest with each other. Hans told her about his journey, the people he had hurt, and how he was trying to repair the past. Lena listened attentively, occasionally holding Hans's hand as if she wanted to share the emotional burden he carried. For Hans, this meeting was more than just a simple reconnection. It was a chance to break free from a past that had dictated who he should be for so long. For the first time in a long while, he felt he could be himself, without Wilhelm's suffocating expectations. Looking into Lena's eyes, he saw not just a sister, but a friend, someone who could understand his pains and share the hope of a new beginning. When they finally said goodbye, Hans knew he had regained something invaluable, a family bond he had feared he had lost forever. Hans always remembered the promise he made to Clara that night at the La Fortuna restaurant. Clara had been the catalyst for the transformation he was now experiencing, and Hans knew that part of his redemption involved helping her achieve her own dreams. He used his resources to support Clara in realizing her dream of opening her own restaurant, something she had always wanted but seemed out of reach due to circumstances. The Open Heart restaurant opened a few months later in a charming part of town that Clara had always considered special. From the start, the place stood out not only for its excellent food, but for the warm atmosphere Clara managed to create. Hans, who had become a regular customer, often sat at a table by the window, watching with pride as Clara's success unfolded. He saw her not only as the waitress who had challenged him to change, but as a talented businesswoman now running one of the town's most beloved establishments. Clara had transformed Open Heart into a place where people felt at home, regardless of their background. Every detail of the restaurant reflected Clara's generous heart, from the carefully prepared dishes to the warm conversations she had with every customer. For Hans, witnessing Clara's success was one of the greatest satisfactions of his new life. He knew that in some way he had been part of something good and lasting, something that symbolized the opposite of the dark empire Wilhelm had built. And each time Clara served him with a smile, Hans felt he had contributed to a better future, not just for her, but for himself. The night was calm, with a gentle breeze blowing through the open windows of Open Heart. Hans was sitting at the table with Benjamin, Susan, Ethan, Emily, and Clara. It was a special night, a celebration of what they had all built together over the months. The restaurant was closed to the public that night, reserved only for this intimate gathering of friends who now considered themselves family. Laughter filled the air, accompanied by the sound of cutlery against plates and the stories everyone shared. Ethan and Emily took turns telling anecdotes about school, while Susan and Clara laughed together, a friendship that had blossomed in the fertile ground of understanding and mutual support. Benjamin, although still more reserved, wore a genuine smile, something Hans had rarely seen in the early days of their acquaintance. Hans observed all of this with a feeling of gratitude that he couldn't express in words. He realized he had found something far more valuable than any material wealth. He had found a true family and a purpose that went beyond any financial ambition. The journey he had started with so much weight on his heart now seemed complete. Hans had found his place, not as Wilhelm Müller's son, but as someone who had chosen a different path. A path made of sincere actions and a transformed heart. As the night began to draw to a close, Clara stood up to make a toast.
To Hans,
She said, raising her glass.
for showing us that we all deserve a second chance and for helping us find ours.
Everyone around the table raised their glasses, warm smiles reflecting the soft glow of the lights. Hans, deeply touched, lifted his own glass, feeling part of something much greater than himself. As he watched the laughter and happiness around him, Hans knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that his journey of redemption was complete. He was no longer the man his father had tried to mold, nor the cold and distant businessman who had lost his humanity. He was a man who, through his actions and the opening of his heart, had found a new purpose, a purpose that gave him the true wealth he had always sought. And so, Surrounded by friends and a new family he had built through sincere actions, Hans finally felt at peace. In the end, Hans discovers that true wealth isn't in money, but in the choices we make and the people we decide to become. He built something money could never buy: respect, friendship, and a new family. This story reminds us that no matter how difficult the road to redemption, peace is possible when we commit to doing good. And you? What are you willing to change in your life to become the best version of yourself? Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, leave a like, and comment on what touched you most in this journey. And if you want more inspiration, click on the final card to watch our next recommended video. Thank you for joining us.